Welcome to a deeper dive where you, the viewers, are offered the opportunity to do the same work and address the same issues as the guest on Iyanla FIX My Life. Now this week, we are diving into part one of a two-part story entitled The Runaway Serial Cheater. Now, in spite of what you saw, this is not just a story about a man who cheated on his wife, had a baby outside of his marriage, and then used drugs. This is a relationship story. A 21-year relationship that was in total dysfunctional breakdown. Now, I can just imagine as you watch that there were many eyes are rolling, many teeth are sucking, and many people screaming out loud, "Oh my God." So let's take a deeper dive into what you saw and what you didn't see so that we can draw value from these two courageous people who put their lives on display in front of the world to see. Now, Mr. Dwight and Miss Alicia were teenagers when they met for the first time and got together. Mr. Dwight was somewhat of a fatherless son because his father died when he was young. This left Mr. Dwight to fall victim to the streets, and Mr. Dwight said it also gave him a very strained relationship with his mother, who he claimed worked all the time and was not in the least bit affectionate, which made him very angry. Now, Miss Alicia was a fatherless daughter because her father was incarcerated and she was a big girl. She grew up overweight and never really felt good about herself. So Miss Alicia was very flattered by the young men who paid attention to her, and Mr. Dwight was just one of them. So when she got pregnant and Mr. Dwight proposed, she jumped at the opportunity. And I'm sure that as teenagers, they really had that loving feeling. But their history and family pathology made them more wound mates than it made them love mates. Now, here's what you didn't see, and it's important for you to know. The energy that Mr. Dwight brought with him. He was much more resistant, aggressive, and belligerent than what may have come across the camera. And he was also high. His posture when he sat down on the sofa was inappropriate. I mean, who slouches on the sofa in front of a television camera if the camera's on you? You also didn't see the length of my first conversation with Mr. Dwight and Miss Alicia. Now, I presented the same question to him no less than 7 times. "Mr. Dwight, why am I here?" And each time he gave me a story about what someone else had done to him, someone outside of the marriage. He also gave me chapter and verse about everything he thought was wrong with Miss Alicia. But he never mentioned to me that he had a habit of leaving home, sometimes for as long as 7 days, without contacting his wife and children. He never mentioned to me that he engaged in the recreational use of drugs. He never mentioned to me that he engaged in intimate relationships outside of his marriage. He never mentioned to me the amount of money he spent on drugs and alcohol that caused financial issues in the family. He never bothered to mention that he had not seen his mother in more than a year and that he still blamed her for the issues between him and his wife. I discovered later that there were many things that Mr. Dwight failed to mention in response to my question. So here's what I hope you did see. How unconscious bad behavior creates a breakdown in a relationship. This is a story about what happens in a relationship when people stay together and don't do their work on themselves or in the relationship. This is a story about passive aggression. This is a story about wounded children who grow into broken adults. This is a story about how children become the collateral damage in a relationship when the adults in their lives fail to recognize their patterns or the pathology. This is also a story about pathology. Mother-daughter pathology, father-son, father-daughter, mother-to-son pathology. This means this story was a study of what causes dis-ease in the mind and heart of people. Now, note to file. You create what you see. This is such a great insight into why we choose the partners we choose. You see, in response to the unresolved pain and what we witness between our parents or the big people in our life, we then replicate that very same behavior or dynamic in our own relationships. And finally, this story gives us a clear picture of how partners wound and harm each other when they don't have the tools necessary to address difficult issues that arise in a relationship. Mr. Dwight having a baby outside of the marriage was not the worst aspect of the story. It was the passive, aggressive behavior both he and Miss Alicia relied on to communicate their upset with each other, and the depth of their pain, the pain they brought into the marriage. This is what they brought into the marriage, and this is what they created in the marriage. His infidelity, her being overweight, him staying out, her silence about his behavior, his recreational drug use, her silence about his drug use, his emotional manipulation and bullying tactics, her withholding sex from him for 7 years, him using the church and religion to try to redeem himself without having a true commitment to changing or healing, and both of them putting their children smack dab in the middle of grown folks' business. That's the pattern. That's the pathology. That's what was going on. The outside child was only one small part of it. And the biggest no-no of all, no consequences for bad behavior. I tell all the couples that I work with, you have got to establish deal breakers, meaning each partner needs to know up front what is absolutely not going to be tolerated. In other words, what will cause you to leave. Now here's some patterns that we discovered and discussed, some of which you saw in this episode and some you didn't see. Again, we only have 42 minutes to cover sometimes 2 or 3 days worth of work. This is a huge lesson, so please make a note to the file. When there are patterns of behavior in a relationship that are left unaddressed, they become the norm, and both partners become numb to the pattern when it is operating. I had a long conversation with Miss Alicia about her passive-aggressive behavior in the marriage, and we identified those behaviors. Mr. Dwight had become as accustomed to her silent treatment as she had become to his disappearing, and neither one of them said anything to the other. Note to file. Check your own passive-aggressive tendencies in your own relationships, okay? Now, what happens when one partner shuts down and bad behavior goes unchecked? Now, what happens when one partner shuts down and bad behavior goes unchecked? It becomes a pattern in a relationship. You see, silence can become a form of acceptance and agreement. And in this case, the wife's failure to establish boundaries or implement consequences encouraged and allowed her husband's bad behavior. Also in this story, as in many relationships, silence becomes complicity in the bad behavior, because by not speaking about it, you give it permission to exist. It is important to set limits with people so that they understand what you are willing to accept and tolerate. So in the absence of boundaries or deal breakers, people in relationships will engage in behavior that are designed to meet their needs, but you'll get stepped on in the process. Mr. Dwight would leave home for days on end. And when he returned, no one, and I do mean no one, the children, the dog, nobody in the house would speak to him. And when they did, they acted as if nothing had happened. So in this way, the bad behavior became the norm, silence became the agreement, and both partners enabled the other to continue in the dysfunction. Now, in episode 2, I give this family a vivid demonstration of how their silent agreements supports and continues the pain. So you don't want to miss that. So what can you get from our dive into this story? Here's a few takeaways I don't want you to miss. In the face of injustice or ill treatment, silence becomes your agreement. If you choose to ignore your pain or refuse to stand up and advocate for yourself, you become a participant in your own victimization. You must advocate for yourself, even in your most loving relationships. And you must let people know what is not acceptable. You know, Mr. Dwight said that after the first affair, it got easier. When he made this statement, he was reminding us that there's little motivation to change a behavior when there are no consequences for engaging in the behavior. To love and support a partner does not mean you agree with what they do. You have to have boundaries. And when you truly, truly love someone and support them, you're going to call them on their stuff. And you must be ready to vote for you when their stuff gets ugly. I want to talk for a moment about emotional manipulation because I called Mr. Dwight on this many times. Emotional manipulation is a behavior or the threat of a behavior exercised to gain influence over someone else with the intention to seize power and control for your benefit. Okay, you got that? It's a behavior or threat of behavior that you use to gain power and control over somebody else for your own benefit. It's also a tactic that people use to create mental distortion or emotional discomfort so that that person can get away with what they're doing and saying. For example, aggression, bullying, belittling, withholding, withdrawing, raising your voice and displaying threatening gestures, guilt baiting, victimhood, pretending to be ignorant, the silent treatment, turning the tables to distract, are all forms of emotional manipulation that creates walls in a relationship so that a person can hide what they're really doing and what they're up to. Bad behavior. And when you see it, you must stop it. Now, these things happen in loving, intimate relationships, family relationships, and friendships all of the time. It is simply bad behavior. And if you don't say anything about it, you give it permission to exist. Now, can you believe this is only the beginning? This was only part 1. So before I get too excited and tell you about next week's episode, I want to remind you to download your worksheet for episode 5 so that you can explore and examine the relationships in your life. Family relationships, friendships, love shifts. That's the good news. Now here's the not so good news. When you download and work with this worksheet, you are going to see some truth about all the relationships in your life. So I hope this was helpful. Don't forget your worksheet. And let me also remind you that you still have a week if you want to join me for the Wonder Woman weekend, October 21st to 23rd in Bethesda, Maryland. You can go to Iyanla.com or InnerVisionsWorldwide.com and learn about this incredible healing and growth process for women. Now, this month, if you want to clean up your energy, I'm recommending Masterpiece Body Wash Blend Purification. It's available at masterpiecebodywash.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Call Me Iyanla so that you can get an inspiring, motivational call from me at least 4 times a week. So until we meet again, stay in peace and not pieces.